Welcome to the Likeville podcast. This is John Faithful Hamer. Today we're going to be talking with professor and writer Joseph Rosen, who's written a lot of interesting articles, most recently one where he went and hung out with a lot of Trump supporters and talks a lot about how to try and find sort of common humanity in a very politicized age and find a middle ground. So welcome, Joseph.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So why don't you sort of tell us a bit about how you got this idea and how you found these people and what you did with them? What's the story?
Well, the original impulse came because after Trump's election, I just felt everybody around me was so angry, and I was too. I felt really angry, and it felt really divided, and it felt like, oh my God, like these monsters are amongst us. Like all of a sudden there was an eruption in society. Like there were all these people who were like monsters and racists and sexists and evil were here, and how could this possibly happen? As a Jew, I was raised with a real paranoia about fascism. I mean, not possibly a perfectly rational paranoia. So you start thinking like, wow, is this how fascism begins? What's happening here? As we saw the alt-right start to pick up as well, and you start seeing a couple of skirmishes between left and right-wing groups in the street, you start to think about Berlin in the late 20s and early 30s. Yep. So I was really concerned about that stuff. But at the same time, it was the most it felt like, oh God, this feels like war, like this hatred of an enemy. And the truth is I felt it inside me. I mean, I saw it in the people around me, in my crowd, the people that I love totally were angry and furious and also quite hateful about these Trump supporters and Trump voters. And on my social media feeds also, it just seemed like we were surrounded by these horrible monsters. And so I sort of thought, well, I didn't like that feeling. I didn't like that feeling of war. And I felt it kind of inside me too, this mixture of kind of like fear and rage. Mm-hmm. And so I thought, well, I kind of want to go talk to some of them and see, like, are they as bad as they appear in my social media feeds?
Okay. Yeah, that's I'm very attracted to that perspective, obviously. I mean, that's to some extent, that's what this podcast is about. But I also am worried by that because it seems to me that if you're trying to find humanity in people, you're going to find it in everybody. I mean, that's I just finished reading James Comey's new book that just came out on Tuesday, The Higher Purpose. And one of the things he talks about, I mean, this is a guy who has chased after corrupt cops and the mafia and all these like horrible. And he says he has lots of amazing stories in there about meeting with hitmen who have killed so many people that they don't even remember how many people they've killed. And he says, you know what? One-on-one, when you're hanging out with them, they're really nice. And he talks about like hanging out with this like mafia hitman who made him dinner. And it was a delicious, like a Italian, like, Sicilian mafia hitman. And he says it was a delicious dinner and we had wine and we had jokes and we laughed and stuff like that. And he said, the truth is when you meet evil, evil laughs, evil can be kind, evil can be considerate. And he said, like, so if you imagine that it's going to be this like, so I guess one of my, and this is always a question I've had in reading your stuff, like all of your stuff, is you're trying really hard to find the humanity in political opponents. And I think that's beautiful. And you're trying to resist demonization. And I also think that's important and beautiful. But there are real issues at stake, right? So how do you sort of, to use the old Christian expression, right, sort of hate the sin and love the sinner? That's a problematic expression, but like, how do you manage to do that?
I don't know. First off, I'm not sure I don't like the characterization of looking for the humanity of people. I mean, interrupting a certain kind of demonization, stopping a certain kind of hatred, a way in which we demonize people on the other side, that's what I want to interrogate. I'm not sure I would put it in that sense of like looking for the humanity in people. I also totally agree. Like deep down, everybody's a good person. Like 6 feet down, everybody. You know what I mean? Like whatever. Like,
remember that amazing scene in what is it? The Talented Mr. Ripley. It's a really creepy scene where, because he narrates this story of his own life, right? And he's this sociopath who like kills people. Yeah. And he says at one point, he's like, "Oh, come on, nobody thinks they're a bad person."
No, of course.
It's so chilling.
Yeah.
After he's just like killed his boyfriend.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, so I don't know. I wouldn't characterize it as looking for the humanity in people. I mean, at one level, I very much want to seek to understand the enemy. In fact, I think there's something. I mean, you mentioned the word evil. So one part of me is like, I'm not actually sure. One part of me thinks I would like to do away with the judgment of evil, possibly. That doesn't mean finding the humanity in someone or being like, oh, deep down, he's a really nice, sweet guy. Like, fucking whatever. Who cares if someone's a nice guy on that day-to-day level, right? Oh, shit. What was I going to say?
So, but evil, like, do you think there's a difference between the way people are in their interactions with one-on-one, in their kind of like people they work with, live with, their neighbors, and their political views? So do you think that somebody can be sort of very, very evil in their attitudes towards outsiders, but very, very kind towards insiders?
That's absolutely guaranteed. That's what
If
white
that's true,
white supremacy is about.
If that's true, then it sort of problematizes the whole project of humanizing the enemy, because the response would be, so what?
I think maybe rather than humanizing the enemy, it's really understanding the enemy. And I know I always misquote Spinoza, whom I've never read, but very good friends of mine have read him quite closely.
That is the most honest thing I've heard in 2018.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
And
that's like up there with, I'm not a doctor, but I play one on TV. Like, yeah.
That's like amazing book titles I have read.
Yeah.
Right? Like I have this great friend. He's like, I've never read this book, but I've been thinking about its title for a decade. And I'm kind of like that sometimes too. So there's this idea somewhere from Spinoza. I'm bastardizing the quote, but he says something like, the most effective thing you can do in the face of evil is to understand it, which actually would not work for most of the highly politicized kind of activists we know and love. They're not interested in understanding whatsoever. But actually, I've been kind of coming around to that. And to be honest, it actually started as a Jewish person thinking about Palestinian suicide bombers. That's where all of this kind of opened up for me. I haven't explicitly written about that yet, but that experiment of like...
You allude to it in the Israel taboo.
Okay, right. Yeah. And really, I spent a lot of time thinking about it and, watching movies about it. And I think this idea of like, can you actually understand what it's like to be inside someone else's perspective? Can you understand what it's like? There's that ancient thing, I used to think it was from the Bible, but it's not. Like, don't judge a man until you walk a mile in his shoes or whatever the hell that is,
In his moccasins.
Okay,
yeah.
I don't know the original
It was
quote.
supposed to be like a sort of an indigenous or like a native, Indian kind of saying. But
is that true?
But it turns out it was actually written by like a white guy in the late 19th century.
Yeah, that's not.
But it doesn't matter. It's actually a good idea.
Right. Right.
That
opens a whole other can of worms.
I said this to Jordan Peterson. He was very upset.
Yeah, Jordan Peterson.
Because he says
it
all the time. He says it all the time. Like, you got to walk a mile and something. I'm like, nobody native said that like ever. But anyway.
You had him here. You got us in the same room, man. You got to get me in the room with that guy.
He's gonna be here next Wednesday.
What?
No, is it Wednesday or Thursday? Thursday.
Right here?
No, he's going to be in Montreal. He's giving a talk in Montreal. We're going. So.
Oh, yeah. All right.
He like...
Right. So there's that sense of really understanding. And so it's not a question of humanizing. Like, actually, one part of me thinks like, I don't know, there's something so wishy-washy and flimmy-flammy about human. It's kind of like, it's more a matter of like, if I was raised in this specific situation, how would I turn out? And like, I assume I'm who I am because of some humanistic sense of my soul or whatever. But what are the ways in which we're very determined? So when I set out on this article, one of my ideas was like, it was almost a joke. I was like, I'm going to find my alt-right doppelganger, right? Which is like a crazy thing for a Jew to say. Or I'm going to try to find like the other, like some other like alt-right opposite of a neurotic urban cosmopolitan Jew. You know what I mean? I'm going to, like, if I had been born in a different situation and like different parents and different whatever, would I have ended up on that side of the fence, right? And it's actually something I thought about originally in terms of Palestinian suicide bombers. When I was like argued with my dad about Israel forever, right? And so, he was always super Zionist. I was raised very Zionist, and then, eventually hung out and, had a great time getting stoned with Palestinians and started seeing their point of view, right? Like, you like, oh, right, stay up all night getting high with Palestinians, and there you go.
Yeah.
It starts to make sense. You start to get a sense of that other side. So after I was arguing with my dad, and eventually one day I was like, Dad, you're so, like, he's so passionate. You're so emotional. You're so ferocious and defensive. Like, what do you think you would have been like? Let's just do a thought experiment. What if you were Palestinian and I was born in the occupied territories? You would be so proud of me for throwing a rock at a tank. And I never saw this look on his face. His jaw dropped. He knew I was right. He knew I was right. For all of his Zionism and all of that stuff, he knew that in that one moment, if he had been born there, he would absolutely want his son to throw a rock at a tank. Of course he would. And in that kind of moment, his face kind of fell apart. And I thought, like, that's what it means to walk. That's what it means to really imagine yourself in somebody else's situation. And think like, I would be a different person if I was born in a different place. I would be a different person if I wasn't born with white privilege. I would be a different person if I wasn't born a straight dude. I would be a different person born in even in a different place, a different province, you know? So it's not a question of humanizing. It's this question of like, where does this person come from? What's the walk? What's the path that is taken to this? And understanding their position as a long trajectory of their sort of social, historical, political context. That is different from humanizing someone, I think.
Well, I wonder, like, if, I wonder if, like, I hear what you're saying, but the fact that your father could be so powerfully moved by that argument sort of makes a couple things obvious to me. It makes obvious to me that, first of all, he believes at least in theory, and actually more than in theory, on an emotional level, in an idea of like universal justice, that things should be like applicable everywhere. He also believes almost sort of instinctually in a kind of idea that, a Rawlsian idea that you should imagine a society, Rawlsian or Kantian idea that you should imagine a society where you could end up anywhere and you want to make sure that what you're doing, a categorical imperative kind of, that would make a society work anywhere, right? I don't think everybody feels that way. I don't think a lot of the people in the world feel that way. And I think emotionally, I think your dad was probably, my guess, I never met your dad, but like I imagine your dad is probably a pretty intellectual person with a pretty broad view, despite his narrow-mindedness on certain questions. Because I know a lot of people that would not be moved by that at all. Like, at all. Like, I grew up with like thugs in Verdun who were, in gangs and stuff like that, who did all sorts of violence. And if you said to them, if you were born in Point St. Charles instead of Verdun, you'd be fighting on the other side of this brawl and trying to stab that guy. And you know what they would do? They would say like, yeah, so what? Yeah, humanity is tribal, and I was born on this team, and I have my loyalties to my particular team, and that's part of life.
Yeah, that's what my dad said to me.
And they would not. Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, I love your dad more and more all the time.
He was just like, yeah, but we were born on this side.
I find that argument very compelling, Joseph.
Oh yeah.
I don't think it's beautiful. But I think it's very, very. We are by nature a very tribal species. We're trying to overcome that in various ways, and we've been successful in doing so to some extent. But I think we're still a very, very tribal species, and we think about not the good of humanity. We think about the good of our tribe, and so I think, just look at, for instance, a good manifestation of this is that in societies the world over, cultures the world over, throughout history, there is a really special antagonism towards apostates and spies and turncoats. Although they're very central to the success of almost any, military venture, or look at the American Revolution, the French Revolution. Turncoats are central to the success of almost any religious movement. Christianity is a bunch of Jews who turned against the fold. But at the same time, almost every human community has a special place of hatred in its heart for turncoats and apostates. So I think what that speaks to is a fundamental sort of understanding and almost sympathy with, like, all right, I'm going to try really hard to win for my team, and you try really hard with yours, and I respect the fact that you're trying really hard. And so I think there's some way in which moderates like us are almost like going against nature. Like we're like perverse.
But I'm not a moderate. You said earlier also the middle of the road. I'm not searching for a middle ground. I think my stuff looks that way. Like I think oftentimes people think, oh, like it's like a moderate voice. Let's not be too far left. Let's not be. That's not at all what
That's not what I take from your work at all. Just for the
not,
record, that's
okay,
not at all. Right. I see you as like sort of a Saul Alinsky, like Machiavelli type. That's like you should probably know your enemy really well. If you if you want to like be successful against your enemy, you should probably I'll tell the art of war kind of thing.
Let's get a little biblical. Let's get a little messianic. I know this is in your wheelhouse. So when you talk about apostates, I'm going to say I've got a really old rant from back when I was younger. Who's the hero of the New Testament? Who is the hero of the New Testament? My call is Judas. Judas, yeah. Judas is the hero of the New Testament, and let me tell you why. Maybe this is the Jewish
Sebastian, get your 30 pieces of silver. So.
Let me tell you why. Because everybody else, because the classic, and Christianity has this real thing, like, be a good person and you're going to get rewarded for it, Everybody else is like, follow your guy, get rewarded. At one level, it's all about self-interest. There's only one guy who's prepared to sacrifice his place in heaven to get the job done. That's how far Judas is prepared to go. Judas is like, I'm not looking for my piece of heaven.
As cold as ice.
Yeah, right? Judas is like, I know what has to be done to get Jesus up on that cross. Somebody's got to fucking go down for this, and I'm going to take the hit. Judas is the only one who's not looking out for himself. Judas is the only one who's like prepared to take the hit.
Did you ghostwrite The Sopranos?
No, but I ghost wrote the New Testament.
I think for me, as a 21st century like Westerner and academic, for me the hero of the New Testament is Thomas, doubting Thomas, like the guy who's just like, look, Lord, I want to believe so bad, but can you just fucking show me some evidence? Can you please just like it's like sort of as Bono says in one of his songs, he's like, and I'd join the movement if there was one that I could believe in. I'd break bread and wine if there was a church that I could be received in.
Right.
Because I need it now. Thomas is like sort of, he's so kind of modern. He's like, look, I really want to believe because I know it's going to be cool if I believe, and I'm going to feel so much better existentially. But can you just fucking show me some evidence, And
I don't actually know who that is, because I actually haven't read the New Testament. Everything I know comes from Jesus Christ Superstar.
Well, so one of the disciples, Thomas, he happens to be sort of like not around when Jesus comes back, right? So they're all like, fuck, man, we saw Jesus. The shit was so cool. Like, and he's just looking at them like a bunch of people that have just come back like on acid from like a rave and like, I saw Krishna, and he's like, yeah, whatever. Like, and he said, like, I'll believe it. I'll believe that he rose from the dead when I can put my fingers in his wounds, in his hands, when I can like. So then Jesus like, whoa, like kind of appears to him like, whoa, and appears to him and says, here, and he puts his finger in like the pierced like parts and stuff like that.
Hot.
And then what would that be, like crucifixion porn? Like, anyway, but like, so then he says, and then Jesus like rebukes him, right? And he says like, it's you're believing because you have like proof, but how much more virtuous are those who believe without having seen, without having the proof? So it's like a real kind of reprimand to people who want evidence and saying like, just having blind faith is cooler. Like, those are the cool kids, and like, you're one of the nerds that wants like evidence, right? So
but you can nerd out over faith, and I got friends that have read all that stuff, and like, you can nerd out over faith, and you have to not believe to have faith and all that stuff. But when it comes to Christianity, the thing I want to talk about, and actually this was the book I started reading, I wish I could remember what it was called. Right after Trump was elected, I started reading a book called oh damn it basically was on the invention of the idea of Satan. I forget what her name is. A scholar, a biblical scholar. It's on like, I think Satan's in the title, and it's on the invention of the idea of Satan. And I know everybody else started reading George Orwell and Aldous Huxley. That's what everyone read after Trump, and I went straight to this.
Mad respect.
Percy Graves, possibly?
No.
Was this written by like who's the person who wrote this? Like, what's his background?
She is an academic, religious studies scholar. I'm sorry, I'm terrible at remembering names and stuff like that. That's why I have a phone. My phone knows. I don't know.
Your phone remembers for you, yeah.
The Origin of Satan, it's called. It's called The Origin of Satan. And her theory in that is that actually that we've always had tribalism. There's always this idea like, oh, you got to. What's that? That's it, Elaine Pagels.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, Elaine Pagels. Yeah. It's a great book. And, we've always had tribes. There's always been this idea, okay, whatever, I'm from Mile End, you're from Verdun or whatever. Fuck Verdun.
Fuck you.
We're gonna go at it. We're gonna but there's also this way of knowing, like, I want Mile End to win. I want to beat, Verdun because it's Verdun or whatever. But, like, there's not this idea. And she says the new idea that Christianity invented is that, guess what? Those guys from Verdun, they're evil. So that your antagonist or your enemy or your opponent is an embodiment of Satan. And she wants to argue this is kind of a new idea that Christianity invented. This is her thesis. I'm not an expert. I wouldn't know, but I think it's interesting. Okay.
Yeah. So
right.
that's strange to say that it's Christianity because we've known at least as far back as Nietzsche that it preceded it with Manichaeanism, with like Zoroastrianism, like the idea of a dualistic universe is right. It's been around for it long predates Christianity. Like that's a bizarre
maybe.
idea.
Well, as I said, I don't know. But my interest is whether maybe that may be true. Maybe it's not. But her thesis is that there's this idea that your enemy, your antagonist, your opponent is an embodiment of the evil principle. Right? I mean, because you can imagine a Manichaeism that doesn't necessarily buy into that same kind of an evil thing. And so, anyways, of course, and we know that, in fact, who was the first embodiment of Satan for the Christians? It was the Jews. That's the start, and that's the start of anti-Semitism.
Well, you killed our
in
Lord.
Europe. That's right. He was one of ours.
It's like such a weird expression. The first time I heard somebody say that, I was like, what? I mean, this was a Jewish sect that was like, breaking away from mainstream Judaism, and
he was the spy, or he was the apostate.
Yeah,
we were just cleaning. We were just cleaning house.
Well, there was a lot of. I mean, I'm sure like for about 2 centuries, there was this just kind of crazy period in Judaism where Judaism was just throwing off all these sparks, like all these messianic movements, all these kind of really cool, crazy movements that were often like a hybrid of a bunch. It was like the 1960s for about 200 years. Like, and they were just like coming off with all these amazing radical movements. And the Jesus movement was one of them. And most people think the only reason the Jesus movement like survived while all the other ones failed is that you had Paul, right? And Paul had the genius idea of making it universalistic, making it open to everybody. Right? Jesus thought of himself as a Jewish reformer. He was just trying to like take, Josiah type. I'm going to take people back to the true faith.
But you know what? The rabbis in Jerusalem say that Paul was actually a Jewish spy in a sense. The rabbis in Jerusalem told me this, that they thought that Paul, he was like, you know what we need to do? We need to shift this around so it doesn't appeal to Jews. We need to respin this whole Jesus story. Let the Goyim take it. Let the Christians have this thing. Let's just spin Jesus a little bit further, and the non-Jews can have that one. It's perfectly reasonable. They can have it. So there's actually this idea. I completely don't think it's true. This is totally counterintelligence. This is totally an ideological, theological position.
Christianity was a false flag operation.
It's not a history. Exactly. But I think it's hilarious we're going to have this whole conversation about, because really, if we're going to talk about Trump, actually what people need to be talking about is Christianity.
Why?
Because this idea of the origin of Satan. So this idea that your enemy is an embodiment of evil is a very specific thing, and you can have evil instant rivalry. Everybody knows the Montreal Canadiens. We have to hate Toronto Maple Leafs.
Absolutely,
right. And for everyone now, we know that this
because they suck.
And we all know that we pretend they're evil, but we actually don't really think they're evil.
I really think they're evil.
But so I think that this idea that your opponent is evil or is an embodiment of Satan is a very specific thing. I mean, Elaine Pagel, for her, this is something that really comes out of Christian culture. I also vaguely feel like it has a very Christian vibe to me in terms of America and how our North American culture is. We're a post-Christian society. Without a doubt, this society has been formed by Christianity. As like a slight outsider, it's easier for me to see that maybe. So I do think that this idea that one's enemy is the embodiment of Satan is there for us. And I think that that's actually a problem. And that's what I want to interrogate. And so this idea that whether it's the alt-right saying that, the cosmopolitan Jewish liberal like me is evil, or whether it's my awesome, amazing, lefty, liberal, artsy, activist friends saying that Trumpsters are evil, that's kind of the political discourse that we're surrounded in, this post-Christian idea that your political antagonist is an embodiment of Satan. And in some ways, that's partly, I'm not comfortable with that. And I want to move past that. I want to find ways to kind of get past that. And in some way, that was what I was thinking about right at the start when I embarked off on this
So
essay.
How did you do that in your research for this article? Like, how did you sort of move past that? I mean, because I remember when you were working on it, you told me all these like crazy stories. Like you were going off in the middle of lakes and like kind of getting baked with like and hanging out with people and getting drunk with them. And you were like actually, like an anthropologist, sort of like just getting right down into, So tell us.
Well, I'm a
about
big
it.
fan of getting stoned with your enemy. In fact, like I think getting stoned with the enemy is a very important thing. And I know it sounds funny because now we think of stoners.
I don't think it sounds funny
Bill
at all.
and Ted's Excellent Adventure.
It makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah, well, I mean, but of course we know from like Aldous Huxley's The Doors of Perception, going back to William Blake, that the idea that drugs opens us up to a mystical perspective where we start to see beyond duality and beyond the dualisms that structure the sort of good versus evil. So in some ways, I think this is a beautiful thing to do. And there's a Jewish holiday called Purim, and it's a story of like all Jewish stories. It's all Jewish holidays. It's the story of people. A whole bunch of people tried to kill us. They ganged up. They tried to exterminate us. We survived.
Yeah,
Let's
the shit didn't work. Yeah.
But this particular holiday of Purim, what I love is there's a mitzvah, which is a spiritual commandment, that what you're supposed to do is you're supposed to get so drunk on Purim that you can't tell the difference between Mordecai, who's considered the hero of the story, and Haman, who's the guy who tried to exterminate the Jews. It's like saying we're gonna commemorate. I mean, we can't say the Holocaust because he wasn't that successful.
Leonard Cohen said that when he wrote Flowers for Hitler, he had Purim in mind.
Yeah.
Exactly what you're talking about.
I didn't know that. Okay, so there you go.
So he was like, you get to a place where you're so, like, sort of seeing, like, everything's infinite.
Exactly. So for white dudes like us, actually, the equivalent is we should get so drunk that we can't tell the difference between Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump. It's maybe it's like that. For like, this is a white dude Purim, white lefty Purim or something like that. Get so drunk you can't tell the difference between Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump. And there's something beautiful about that. And it's one of the few mitzvot that I take quite seriously in my life. Like, I like this idea that you should get so inebriated. There's this one day a year you should get so inebriated you cannot tell the difference between your own nationalistic self-identified hero and your enemy. That's not for 365 days of the year. That's actually one day of the year. And in fact, I know rabbis in Jerusalem who take acid one time a year. They're these ex-hippies, but there's a whole
no wonder I love Israel.
There's an ex-hippie rabbis in Jerusalem scene, and I hung out with a couple of them, and they would take acid once a year on Purim in Jerusalem.
Oh my God!
And for them, so awesome. they were fulfilling this mitzvah, the Purim mitzvah.
Yeah, that's amazing.
So it's more. I think that's very different from finding the humanity in your enemy. I just think it's a different thing.
Yeah. No, I see that. I see that. It's I guess the issue is that I know those experiences. I've had those experiences and they're very, very powerful. But one of the problems with that is that I think enmity, and I'm sort of pushing you on this point, but enmity is real, right? Enmity is real. And that's I find a real blind spot not on the progressive left. I think progressives understand that enmity is like a real thing. They understand that on many issues it's a zero-sum game. They see what's going on. But liberals in general, and I would say sort of kind of moderate conservatives, they seem to really buy into this idea that why can't we all just get along? Why can't we all just get along? And I love that idea because I think a lot of conflict is actually not necessary. It's just the fact that we're not communicating correctly and we're not listening to each other. And, the sort of kind of marriage counselor view of politics and like, world conflict, that, oh, you just need to like listen to each other and active listening, and I buy that to some extent. But I also think where the kind of hard left progressives and more sort of tribalistic conservatives, where they actually see what the fuck is going on more than everybody in the middle, is that they understand that sometimes both people want the same piece of land. Sometimes both people are in love with the same girl. Sometimes both people want the same thing, and there's no way for both people to like, the expression all is fair in love and war. It's a harsh statement, but there's some truth to it. Like sometimes both people want the same thing. Sometimes you think that my trans kid should not be able to live a certain life, and I think otherwise, and one of us is going to fucking lose. Like, so I think that's always like the tension I have with the idea of kind of trying to understand. So I would say also what you were saying about like these rabbis doing acid and like understanding your enemy. I think that's amazing, but as somebody who's consumed a fair amount of drugs in my life, I also know that the insights that you have when you are on hallucinogenics, some of them are really interesting. And, later on when you after the ecstasy, as it were, when you sober up, you think about it and you're like, that was a fucking really good idea, right? But a lot of it is total bullshit. Like a lot of it is like you think, I mean, I even had this like recently.
Oh, you're getting high with the wrong people then.
Oh, no. I have like, one guy who, my friend Albert Nuremberg, who we had in the podcast, like we got like really baked and we were walking around. I guess I shouldn't say that. Whatever, I'm going to say it. Sorry, Albert. I just outed you. But so we got like really baked and we were walking down St. Catherine Street and we had this like amazing conversation where we understood everything, right? And we had everything figured out. And I actually like really, really thought that, we had all this stuff figured out. And then like the next day I was like sifting through,
sure,
like somebody panning for gold. I was like sifting through, the second time. But I was like sort of sifting through the ideas that we had. And
well, you're knocking over your first beer there, are you? I don't know. Can you handle your acid?
I don't know if I can. Yeah. Don't go for the brown acid. But I was sifting through and some of the ideas were completely wrong, right? And some of them like made a great deal of sense, right? So I guess my issue is when people go to a rave or they go to like where there's just this wonderful like, like a John Lennon, like, imagine, right? Imagine there's no religion, no countries too, right? And we can all just be one. I think that is a kind of a delusion, which does not acknowledge the fact that actually the way the human heart works is via selective sympathy. Like we have, like I care about I'm sure you do too. I care about my two kids way more than I care about other kids, and I'm sure you care about your two kids way more than my kids or other people's kids.
Well, my kids are a lot cooler than your kids.
You see, that is like exactly the response that I want from you, right? Is to acknowledge the fact that like we have our selective sympathies. We care about our own kids. We care about our own family, our own tribe, our own group. And this idea that we can somehow transcend that, I think, like, not only is...
We totally can. I on the one hand, hear what you're saying. Like, I also, if you want me to go off on an anti-hippie rant, I can do that totally easily. I mean, actually...
Oh, no, I don't want that.
That whole, like...
No,
but the whole, like... Yeah, no, that whole hippie, like, why can't we get along? Which was the really, I think, Anyways, why can't we get along is just a terribly cliche phrase. And that... There's a certain kind of, like...
It trivializes all the issues.
No, there's a certain kind of really casual kind of hippie stonerism that we could talk about as actually an effect of white privilege whatsoever, right? Like totally privileged kids who don't give a shit whatsoever and have never experienced oppression. They're the ones who can say, "Oh, I belong to everywhere. I don't have a tribe," right? And I think that's one of the things we see at play in amongst liberals. Is it actually saying, I don't have a tribe, I'm a citizen of the world.
I very much have tribes.
Yeah, we can think about that as a function
that I'm
of
a part
privilege,
of.
right? If you're not part of a group that has been oppressed or are assaulted or whatever. And this could, whether you're indigenous or whether you're a woman, or there's 1,000 examples, that it's really easy to feel like, oh, I'm a part of everyone, right? Like when you experience suffering to a certain degree, you get tribalized. Our tribal identities kind of come from suffering to a certain degree. I mean, that's like kind of the fundamental Jewish thing at a certain level, like it's sort of like it really anticipates identity politics. So I totally get identity politics in a bunch of ways because of that. And to say, like, why can't we all get along is ridiculous. But I think that what I'm interested in, it's not a question of, I don't like these ideas, like the idea, on the one hand, this idea that we're just sort of like, oh, I'm some universal subject, I love everybody, seems totally baloney to me. It seems very intellectual. But also this idea that, like, I'm just of my tribe and that's it, also be of my tribe, is also like, well, whatever, I don't know. Like, I get that some people are like that, but what if it's not about our interiority? It's not about our personality. It's not about our choices. It's very much about, like, who are the people that you bump into? What are the places you end up in? Who do you encounter and who do you hang out with? So at one level, like, sure, we have a tribal instinct, and like my father never met a Palestinian in his life. Like, I don't think my dad's ever hung out with Arabs in any way whatsoever. And it's not about his identity. It's about the fact that he never hung out with Arabs. I myself have spent long nights stoned with Palestinians, and that's the key thing, right? No, but that's actually the key thing. Like, it's not about me.
Yeah.
It's not about my decision. I'm not some special soul. I'm not some extra great liberal, like, my conscience is so delicate, I'm so beautiful, I care more about people than John. John's just a guy from Verdun. Like, no, like, it's not about that at all. I just randomly, due to no effort on myself, ended up in a situation where I was hanging out with those people. And this is kind of why cities are so important. And this is kind of why our specific experiences and our context, our social context are so important, right? When you encounter people in those ways, it's going to change who you are. So for my life, it's like, who is my tribe? Like, there's very sociological reasons as to why I'm not a tribalist. Mm-hmm. I didn't go to a Jewish school. I've met my best friend in high school.
I've known you for a long time, and I find that you are actually far more empathetic than the average person that I know, like way more, and far more sort of open to new experience and stuff like that. And so for me, one of the fundamental sort of epistemological blind spots that we all have, and this is something that I struggle with like crazy, in relationships, as a teacher, in family life, everything, is that we have a natural tendency to assume that other people are like us, right? And I think like one of the important things to realize is that like other people aren't like you, and they have like all this other shit going on, and it's like not like you, right? And so I think one of the blind spots that somebody who's really tribal is that they assume everybody else is tribal. This is another thing, going back to Comey's book. Comey says that when he met with Trump and he told Trump about like the Steele dossier, Trump immediately thought that this was an FBI shakedown, that this was like Hoover meeting with like a new president to say, hey, we've got lots of dirt on you, so don't fuck with us. And actually Comey was not doing that at all. He was just trying to like alert him to, hey, there's this thing that's circulating and you should know about it, and we're looking into like what's going on. And he says, I realize now in retrospect that like that's the way Trump thinks, that's the way his mind works. And so if he was coming to confront somebody with this information, it would be a shakedown, right? So people who are super tribalistic imagine everybody else is tribalistic. People who are very open, like you, very open to new experience and very empathetic, I think there's a tendency to imagine that everybody else is like that. But they're not.
No.
They're really not like you, Joseph. Like,
no.
You're like a, I don't know, less than 5% of the people I know are anything like you. So how do you make peace? How do you make society work when most people are not like you?
Yeah, I mean that was one of the really, really frustrating things about the process of this article, is being like talking to a couple guys and being like, I am so interested in listening to them non-judgmentally, and then I had this weird moment where at the end of the day I was like, oh yeah, but these guys aren't listening to me at all. Like, and at the end realizing like, oh, I can actually go a fair way in terms of understanding where they're coming from, like really extending them a fair amount of credit, extending them a fair amount of understanding and listening. And then when it turned around, and sometimes when I'd hear them repeat back what they thought I was, I'd be like, wow, these guys have not been hanging out with me. Like, they have no clue who I am or where I'm coming from. In fact, they're kind of projecting their own stuff onto me in a huge way. And it was really frustrating. And it was like, Writing this article was horrible, man. It was the hardest article I've ever written. It
Really?
was totally the worst.
More than the Israel taboo.
More than anything.
Wow.
It doesn't make sense. The other things you would think would be way harder. And for every other article, also, I received way more hate mail. I haven't received any hate mail for this. I mean, a little bit of stuff on Twitter, like some snarky comments on Twitter.
The piece on the Hasidic Jewish community in Montreal, you got a lot on that? Okay.
Yeah. Well, some, whatever, not a lot. And in some ways, the kind of part of the nightmare was like realize I had this moment where like, and it was funny. I go back to my own little inner baby, and I'm like, they're not listening to me. No one's listening. I'm listening to them, and they're not listening to me. And I feel like this is so unfair. And like, it was like kind of this moment I had, right? And and it's a right. And actually, what was great was I talked to this guy Misha Globerman in Toronto, who's fantastic and who runs an amazing program called How to Talk to People About Things. I think that's what it's called. Oh, maybe our guy to double check that. I'll do it. Yeah, How to Talk. I think it's How to Talk to People About Things. And I chatted with him about this, and he was like, these great answers. He was like, sure. He was like, you're assuming the other guy's playing the same game as you. You're playing this game where your game was like, hey, let's listen to each other. And that's it, yeah. And the other guy never agreed to this game. The other guy never agreed to being like, I'm going to really listen to you. No, you said, hey, I'm writing this article for the Walrus. I'd love to chat with you. Do you want to explain your thing to me? And that's what they agreed to. And so he kind of had a little bit of tough love advice for me, which is beautiful and was awesome. And he was just like, yeah, they didn't agree to that. This is your game. These are your rules. And so, but what he also said was that he was like, listening is a transformative practice. And even if only one person is listening, even if only one person is trying to understand, it still means there's more understanding in the world and there's more empathy in the world. And it was kind of great because I kind of found a little bit of peace and I was like, right, this doesn't need to be symmetrical. Like the other people don't have to listen to me. In fact, in a weird way, if I understand them really well, better than they understand me, even in a Machiavellian sense, I win.
Yeah, I guess I want to believe you're right, and in my heart, I kind of like I think you're right, but I think it's a very, very complicated question. I mean, I'm thinking about that wonderful scene at the end of the Magic Mountain, Thomas Mann's Magic Mountain, where Naphtha and Settembrini, right? Settembrini is like representing the Enlightenment ideal that we can all sort of like recognize our common humanity, and Naphtha is this Jesuit who's like, no. Reason and conversation are all about trying to score points for your side, right? And they end up getting into like a duel, and I don't know if you remember, like at the end, like they get into a duel, and like they walk their paces, and they turn around, and Settembrini doesn't pull out his gun, he doesn't shoot, and after shoots and like misses him, and he is absolutely infuriated that Settembrini actually walks his talk. He's like, I'm not gonna shoot at you, and he just has it's like this like Gandhi like shit, like really like Jedi, like whoa, these are not the droids. Yeah. And it's very, very powerful moment. But what's presented in the Magic Mountain in their debates throughout the novel is that there's some really good arguments on either side, and there's some serious stuff at stake, and it's not obvious which one is right. Yeah. So what did these sort of alt-right people that you hung out with, like, what do you think motivates them? Like, what is going on with them? Like, why do they like the ideas they like and the people that they like? Why do they hate the people they hate and the ideas they hate?
I mean, first off, I don't think I really hung out with them enough to answer that question with any real confidence. I think you got to know someone pretty well. But one thing I would say is that they all feel under attack. They all feel, I think, quite threatened. And it's one of those funny things. For all of their bullshit about being alphas, they're all at one level kind of scared and feel
little bitches,
and feel threatened. The technical term, might be the technical term.
Little bitches, yeah.
So they all really feel under threat, and despite all their, all that sort of alpha male stuff that comes up quite regularly, and I also think like I didn't do anything systematic. I don't have any scientific things, but like gender was way more of an issue than race for the people I talk to. I think like they're what it means to be alpha. What I could get, I was accused of being a beta male and not having enough testosterone and blah 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 all that stuff. And it's like
I can
okay,
attest
like,
to your high testosterone.
Being a dude is like clearly an issue for these guys,
Yeah.
But I don't want to sound like an asshole. I mean, they've got they feel under threat. They actually feel scared. They feel scared. And I think in some ways, I went and checked in with my shrink about it at one point, and it was like, and his take was a little bit like, people feel vulnerable. People feel very, very vulnerable. Actually, they feel vulnerable and threatened and scared, and they kind of lash out and attack. And so in some ways, I'm trying to remember, his take was very much like, why is the political discourse so antagonistic? It's because people feel vulnerable, and rather than kind of owning their own vulnerability and feeling confident in their vulnerability in that sense, they actually go on the counterattack. And I think that's one of the things we don't understand. We always see the enemy as they're the first ones who go on the attack. And I know this from the Israel-Palestine things. Like, there's a line in that one in the Israel taboo where it's just like, they're all like children in a playground saying, he started it.
He hit me first.
Everybody thinks they're responding to the first aggression. And the other person created the first aggression. And so people actually feel vulnerable. They feel under threat to a variety of ways. And I know there's a whole way, and now amongst activists, there's this new language of being like, oh, white fragility. Fuck you, motherfucker, with your fucking white fragility. And at one level, I totally get that. Like, there's nothing more irritating than a hyper-fragile, privileged guy. Like, there's something on the one hand that's super fucking irritating about that. On the other hand, it's like, I don't know, man, when people are feeling vulnerable and unthreatened, doubling down on your attack on them, it's just plain going to backfire. Like, it's going to create more hostility and more war. If you want to double down that logic, if you want to say, guess what? This is us against these fucking fragile, white, candy-ass fucking baby men. Let's double down and go to fucking war.
Yeah.
Like, okay, but from another perspective, it's like, is that working? And in some ways, I would say, is that working? And my one-word answer to you is Trump.
Yeah.
Trump is evidence that in some ways that has partly backfired. So is there another way to approach these baby men? Yeah. Gertrude Stein in like 1918
By the way,
I
just want to say I completely agree with you.
Okay, yeah.
And this is something that a woman that I'm not going to mention her name because she's probably going to listen to this, but like a woman, an older woman that I respect immensely, said exactly the same thing that you just said. She said, when I first heard this discourse around white fragility, she goes, it just sets off my bullshit meters like crazy. She goes, obviously, yes. Is there such a thing as white fragility? For sure. But she goes, I think most of what is being called white fragility is basically analogous to what used to be called like female fragility. So a guy would say some incredibly offensive things in my face and be like a real like fucking asshole towards me. And then if you respond and get upset, they say, God, you women, you're so emotional. Like, why are you like getting so, God, you really just can't like, it's like, well, I'm getting upset because you're being really offensive. And she goes, so these people get into a situation where they're actually, you listen to them, they're being really, really abusive. They're not speaking in general terms the way we would talk about like systemic issues. They're not talking about, they're personalizing it. Like, you're this, right? And they're being like very, very offensive. And then they act surprised when somebody responds like an offended person, right? And they say, oh, God, white fragility. Like, no, actually, I'm like, this is human fragility. Like, you're being a dick. And so I'm responding. I'm not a Stoic. I'm not a Buddhist. I'm responding like somebody's treating me like, in a really bad way, right? And so it becomes, she goes, it reminds me so much. She said it reminds me so much of the late 60s and early 70s when the feminist when that was kind of coming and we were getting very kind of fired up and we would like respond to people being really kind of abusive, and they would automatically, certain kind of guy would automatically say, oh, you women are you're such, the equivalent of you're such snowflakes, right? Like, right. You're such snowflakes.
I wouldn't want to make those equivalent. I wouldn't want to make those two situations equivalent. I mean, I think white fragility is a totally real thing. I think male fragility is a totally real thing.
I completely agree.
And the real,
I'm not making an equivalence.
Right.
I'm saying that it's dealing with the same aspect of the human heart, right? The same kind of human response to somebody being, right? Like, I agree.
Oh, now who's looking for the humanity?
I'm always looking for the humanity. I just recognize the limitations of the humanity.
I mean, I think white fragility is a totally real thing, and masculine fragility is a totally real thing. And it's like, but on the one hand, I just think that we don't need to look at it, and that's because those people are evil. Like, I actually think it's a very real response. You have these guys who are raised to think they're supposed to be successful, they're supposed to be this, they're supposed to be that, and actually at this point the economy just doesn't bear that. You don't have the job for those guys. They're not able to buy real estate in a serious city anymore. None of that is possible. And so the fragility and the kind of reactionary space they're having, it comes very much out of their social kind of place. It comes out of if you're raised in that place with those expectations. So I really think it's great to depersonalize it. And the problem with saying someone's evil is that makes it about their individuality, as if like, oh, you're a tarnished soul. You're an ugly soul. And I think in a weird way, we need to think a lot more in terms of like sociological categories, right? Like in terms of people get to that place because if you're a white dude raised with certain expectations and your parents make you think this and your culture and your movies all tell you, and movies today, and every movie I watch, people are either an architect or whatever. Like, it's like there's no movies about guys who work at factories anymore. There's just movies about architects, right? Mm-hmm. So these white guys that are super fragile, like they're coming out of a space, and it's not that they're horrible people. Right, they're like their sociological, political, historical context has led them to this extreme fragility. I think it's an absolutely real thing, and I think the question we want to ask ourselves is, how do we deal with this in a successful way, as opposed to demonizing it, as opposed to demonizing people for their white fragility or whatever kind of fragility it is, you know? So it's like, it's a real thing, it exists, it's produced by certain sociological conditions. How do we help these people out of it? Right, a friend of mine, Matt, in Toronto, will always talk about this. He's just like, what about things like, well, these people they haven't figured out their situation. They don't understand where their vulnerability comes from. They don't understand why they're so angry. They don't understand why they feel so impotent. They don't understand why they think they're supposed to be so much better than they are. They're supposed to be so much more, and they feel like losers because they haven't fucking accomplished X, and they haven't fucking accomplished Y, and they haven't done all of this. And so it's like, we can demonize them, or we can kind of help them understand. Like, how do you actually help people who don't have the tools to understand why they're in the situation where they are, you know, like that. And it's a much more compassionate lens to bring, right? And again, this isn't about humanizing the people. It's about like, how do we find a more empathetic, compassionate way of dealing with these people who are suffering from white fragility, as opposed to saying like, you're a total fucking asshole and get off the fucking island, motherfucker, because you're a fucking son of a bitch. It's like, no, this is just some guy who hasn't, you know, maybe, you know, guess what? Maybe he didn't get to go and get a PhD like me and you did.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
Maybe he didn't have the kind of luxuries that he got to live in amazing cosmopolitan cities where you get to hang out with every kind of person and stuff like that, right? He's stuck in some podunk little town. He didn't get sent to university or whatever, you know? And so why are we judging these people as evil as opposed to seeing them as people who don't have resources to don't have access to the resources we do? And how can we help them out of that hole of white fragility and anger and reactionary, et cetera?
Well, you know, I find it very interesting that, you know, we had a kind of a meeting that was called by some people in my department at the beginning of the fall semester, and they said, we want to it was like an emergency meeting, right? We need to talk about the sort of the alt-right on campus, and the fact that like the alt-right is sort of basically kind of campaigning and sort of winning souls, you know, on campus and stuff like that. And I remember when I saw this email that went out, I thought, this is absolutely hilarious, because it was just completely wrong. Like, and I was thinking about the students that I knew who were kind of into alt-right ideas that I had in my class and that I knew them.
We all have them now. We all have them.
Yeah, we all have them. And like the students that were into that stuff, I don't know one student. Oh, okay, one exception. I know one exception. But almost all the students I know who have got into these ideas, their conversion on the road to Damascus, their sort of kind of moment that turned them towards this, had nothing to do with listening to an alt-right speaker. What it had was an interaction with progressive thinkers that humiliated them. It was like sort of, to take the example that immediately, Herzl, when he talks about seeing Dreyfus publicly humiliated. And this is when he became a Zionist, like seeing him and seeing, you know what, this universalistic project in France, it's fucking bullshit. And like seeing, the scene, right? And he was very committed to the Enlightenment, very much committed to the French state. And when he saw this, that was his conversion experience. It wasn't some, sort of Zionist rabbi coming and preaching to him. It was like looking at this humiliation. And so, most of the vast majority, literally all but one of the like guys that I've known, a few women who've gotten into these alt-right ideas, they get into that because of progressive profs who do like the backpack sort of thing in the class where you and they talk about privilege and they personalize stuff and they make, this one guy I'm thinking of who I mentioned when I was talking to Barbara Kay the other day. He's like, how can I say this without being too clear? Okay, he's a poor kid from a farm in southwestern Quebec, an Anglo kid who, I know where he comes from, and it's an incredibly poor town, like really, really intense. Like most houses, it's in Quebec, and the places are not properly insulated. It's like really, really poor. And so for him to sit in one of my colleagues' classes, as he did, and be told that because he's a straight white male, he has all this privilege when his dad is addicted to painkillers and his mom is in and out of the Douglas Hospital, and he's his sister was pregnant at 14. He's really, really, his teeth are a mess because he doesn't have proper dental care. And to have this, this woman who grew up in Westmount and went to private schools in Westmount and has gone to all the best schools and has traveled, tell him that he has white privilege. That is what radicalized him. That's why he's into the alt-right now. And that's the story I've heard more than anything else. So I wonder.
Wait, so you're saying the alt-right is produced by humanities profs?
No.
I don't think you want to say that.
No, I definitely would not say that. But I'm saying that very often it's not so much that people are being converted by the evangelist, as it were. They're being converted because of a discourse that humiliates them.
Right. I think I want to say two things. I think this is a little bit correct, but I want to add something else. I think I do think that moralistic, judgmental thing, and of the people that I talked to, it was surprising how almost one of their number one things was a reaction against PC culture, against politically correct moralism and judgmentalism. And again, all my friends are PC, and I love that culture, and I totally get it, and I understand how necessary it is in all kinds of ways. So I don't want to be I don't want to be trashing PC culture. I think that in PC culture makes a lot of sense. However,
what do you think PC culture is?
Well, I think there's certain values that we have, and I think we've come to these values. And I got to be honest, I think these values are awesome. Like being pro.
Because that's what I was talking to Barbara Kay about. I said I think PC culture is ultimately about just trying to not be a dick.
Well, I think
just trying to be nice.
No, there's very serious things. You come to certain things so at a certain level in our circles, being pro-trans kids, being pro-multiculturalism, pro-cosmopolitanism, pro-immigrants, all for kind of cultural hybridity, not assuming on one kind of all that kind of stuff. We could go on and on, whatever. And all that kind of stuff is great and it's kind of awesome. I think the problem though is that when we bash other people over the head with those values, the other people who don't share those values yet. And then we judge them and moralize against them and call them idiots and call them racist and call them sexist and call them ignorant and call them inbred banjo-plucking hillbillies and all that stuff. That's kind of the problem. It's when it veers off into that, I think, we find a problem. Nobody wants to be demonized. Nobody wants to be told that. They want invite people on board. Find a way to invite people on board. If you think that shit's beautiful, invite people on board. Hey, guys, come check this out. I've been exposed to a bunch of things. Really, this is the awesome way to live. I live in this cosmopolitan big city. Not everybody has been raised in these cosmopolitan big cities. Not everybody has these advantages. Make your argument. And also, it's about that personal thing. Invite somebody on board. as opposed to that whole being like, oh, guess what? If you're not on board with my politics, you're obviously a fucking asshole. Like that doesn't work. And I see in the classroom how it doesn't work. I see how that moralizing, present an opinion and present it like either if you're cool, you believe this, and if you're an idiot, you don't. That divides a classroom. That totally divides a classroom. I see it happen when I'm talking about gender and I'm talking about feminism all the time. And I can see how when you sort of like, if you just assume either you're feminist or you're an asshole, and maybe like a quarter of the class tunes out, and you can see them. You see all those dudes just tune out. And I don't want those guys tuning out. I want to talk to everyone. So I'll be like, let me tell you, white dude, why is feminism awesome? Why actually is feminism going to help you live a more authentic, honest, real life? How is feminism going to help you be the person you actually want to be? That's the argument to make, not to sort of like have this passive aggressive judgmental idea like, oh, you better believe this, or if you don't, you're a real jerk. Just an unsuccessful strategy. It's an unsuccessful strategy. Like, I think the liberals and the left, we need to make those arguments. Like, and so when you're talking to the straight white guy in the back of the room, let me tell you why negotiating the complexities of being a straight white dude, you gotta listen to some of the stuff that feminism has to say. Like, this is gonna help you be the superhero that you want to be. That's what it's about. It's not about criticizing you for being the wrong thing, right? So I really feel actually that like we need a very different strategy. And again, it can't be proselytizing. It can't be saying like, and again, you might not like this because I tend to sometimes go a little bit rough on Christianity. That whole parable of the mustard seed. Like, some people get it and the evil people don't. And it's like, oh, give me a break. Like, I will throw my seed. This is the Jesus thing. I will throw my seed out over the rocks.
He spilled his seed to the ground.
I will spill my seed on the ground. And those of you with beautiful souls will become impregnated. And those of you with ugly souls will reject my seed. That's fucking bullshit. Like, that's a bullshit, moralistic kind of thing.
If you frame it that way, I don't frame it that way. The way I frame it, I think actually what you're talking about, that basic idea is a kind of a faith that you cannot possibly be a successful teacher unless you have that faith in some form. I tell that to like new hires in our department. I say like, if you don't believe in the idea of like the mustard seed, if you don't believe in that, you can't, because you need to, in your heart, you have to believe that, like for instance, there's a lot of things that I'm sort of thick about, like for instance, shorting a stock, right? Like that is an idea that for some reason I had a really hard time understanding it. Like somebody explained it to me, I would guess like probably I had to hear it like 17 times before like I got it, right? And then I finally got it. I was like, oh my God, I get it. And I was like, I get it. So all of those people who explained it to me the first time, the 5th time, the 11th time, the 14th time, would you judge them to be a failure? Like, well, no, because I needed to hear it. It wasn't like the person who told me the 17th time said it in a special way. They just sort of were building on all these other people that were explaining this to me. And I think actually enlightenment happens that way most of the time. We don't hear it once and have this magical conversion on the road to Damascus. Most of the time we need to hear something. We're thick, we are a stiff-necked people. So like most of the time we need to hear things many, many times. And so I think as a teacher in any context and as an activist, I would say, I remember I had a conversation with Paul Watson, right? One of the founders of Greenpeace and the founder of Sea Shepherd. And I had this wonderful drunken conversation with him where he said, I think to be an activist long term, you need to have the ethic of the warrior, which is I do what I do because I believe it's right, and I don't think too much about the result. I don't try and be too consequentialistic about it, because like if you focus too much on the result, you're going to get really kind of disappointed when things are not going well, and you're going to get far too excited when you have some victories. And it's much better to say like, I'm going to do what I'm doing. And I think if you're a teacher, you absolutely have to kind of take the long view and say, like, I'm trying to influence people in a certain direction, and I don't need to see the result right away.
I think it's right. I mean, on the one hand, the way you're applying this mustard seed thing to teaching, I totally buy. I believe, and like when I look back, it's one of the things that I sometimes try to remind lefty friends too. Is like on all the ways in which I really changed my mind, and some stuff like. Again, it's white privilege is also having no skin in the game. So some people, there's always, every once in a while I'll meet white people who are just like, oh yeah, come on, free Palestine. It's like, okay, sure, but that and $5 gets you a Starbucks coffee. Like for you can just yell free Palestine and it's no skin off. You have no skin in the game whatsoever. And if you're Jewish, it's a different story. You're like, there's real stakes here.
Sure.
There's like, do I have a safe place for my people who have been persecuted over time in the Holocaust and yada, yada, yada. I mean, it's a complicated thing. And to have skin in the game, I know that's big right wing. They talk about that all the time. I think Jordan Peterson loves that shit. I want to go head to head with Jordan Peterson on skin in the game.
But that's
because I'm curious.
Idea,
I'd love to know what his
idea.
Skin in the game is. But so there's a way in which like what does it mean to have skin in the game? And I think that, anyways, as a teacher, over the long run, it takes a long time to kind of come around. So you might have some white privileged kid who can come around. All he needs is a pretty girl to tell him, guess what, Palestine's cool. And he's going to be like, all right, free Palestine. That's it. That's it. You know, whereas like other people, if you have skin in the game, which is to say, if you're not fully a subject of total privilege, it's going to take you a while to come around. It's going to take you a while to kind of figure out a different politics. And so I firmly believe, and in the article, I loved it. There's this one, the fundamentalist Christian, who's saying like, you know, it was just yesterday we were kind of told like to try to accept gay people. And now we're supposed to expect like we're supposed to understand transgender kids. And he was like, it's just happening so fast. There's no time to kind of get your head around it. And I really found myself sympathetic to his argument there. It's like, right. You can say stuff that you think, and you can think, I'm going to say it once, and the other person should just get it. When it's like, you know, the actual, if I have skin in the game, it takes me multiple years to really come around. I'm talking very personally.
Well, maybe the problem right there is sort of a framing problem, because like, I don't think you need to sympathize with a trans person at all. I mean, I think that's ideal. That would be nice. That's sweet. That's human. It's my preference. But I don't think you need to, in the same way that I don't need to sympathize with somebody who believes in all that chakra shit. I don't need to like sympathize with a Mormon who believes that like an angel came to Vermont to talk to like Joseph Smith. Why would any angel go to Vermont? But like I don't need to believe that stuff in order to respect them as a human being and be like, you know what, I'm gonna let you do your thing and I'm gonna do my thing, and as long as you're not like getting in my way, I'll stay out of your way. So I think maybe we're like asking too much, that people have to necessarily like, you know, understand each other on all this stuff, right? But,
no, it's not about understand. I mean, well, no, but it is. This is proselytization in the real sense. It's like, I believe things firmly. Like okay. I believe Palestinians should have their autonomy. I believe that in a very strong way. I believe that gender should be equal. Like I believe that patriarchy as a system of structural violence against women should be ended. I believe this in a huge way. I think it's the right way to live. I think. But
do you really think it's like a structural thing? Because like, okay, I guess, you know, I don't want to like put too many words in your mouth, but like I learned about white privilege, I imagine, in a very different way than you did. I imagine you learned about it at York when you were taking classes with like sort of cool professors and stuff like that. I learned about it as a criminal teenager in Montreal. And so we had this like game, it was a scam. We would like go to stores and we would have like, there would usually be like, you know, like 3 or 4, sometimes 5 of us. And usually like, you know, 2 black kids and 3 white kids or something like that. And the black kid would like dress up really, even if they were like actually into Depeche Mode, they would like, for the event, they would like dress up in really kind of like rap, like hip hop gear, and would be like listening to really, really loud, like, you know, rap music on their hip hop, and would be like, you know, going like this. And they would walk in the store and all of the store staff would follow them around like crazy. And meanwhile, the white kids would be fucking robbing them blind. and then we would leave the store later on, and we would meet together at the metro, and we would divvy the stuff up in 3 or 4, right? And we ran this scam for 2 years, right? And we finally got caught at a mall in Anjou, right? And it was because the guy who caught us was Haitian, right? And he basically, because he wasn't blinded by sort of racism, he just looked at what was actually happening, right? Like the behavior, right? And he sort of saw that we were actually robbing the place, right? And so he caught us, and he was actually really, really nice about it. And he said if we promised to change our ways, he would not call the police and stuff like that. And so he called my mom and told my mom, and my mom was unbelievably mad at me for a long time. But anyway, so I definitely understood that I had white privilege in the sense that when I was hanging out with my Mohawk friends, I was dealing cigarettes and stuff like that on the avenues, and my Mohawk friends, if they were driving with a backpack, would get pulled over all the time. I wouldn't. I could bike right over the Mercier Bridge with a backpack full of sort of reservation cigarettes, and nobody would stop me at all. And I could rob in a mall and get away with it. So I understand definitely that there's white privilege in the sense that people have different expectations.
We're agreed. It exists. Yeah.
But I think your idea of white privilege, my impression, I don't know if it's, I could be wrong here, but the sort of academic idea of white privilege strikes me as, what I'm talking about is a very pragmatic thing that is a function of prejudice. It's a function of the fact that we are calculating animals, and so if we can be killed by a snake that is brightly colored, whenever we see a brightly colored snake, we recoil, even though it could be non-venomous. So I see sort of prejudice as being, as Aaron Haspel puts it, stereotypes are folk statistics, right? So if you have an idea, rightly or wrongly, that a certain category of person is going to be potentially more of a threat, then you're going to respond in that way, right? So I see it, for instance, if I'm walking home and Annalisa's walking at home alone, and we're walking behind a woman, and she looks behind, and she sees me and is worried, and sees her and is not worried, I get that, right? Because statistically speaking, I'm more likely in her mind to be a threat. So I will often walk to the other side of the street just to because I get it, Yeah. I'm not going to say you
gotta focus, dude. You're losing me.
You're a jerk, right? So my point is, I think your idea of white privilege as being this kind of metaphysical thing, almost like original sin, I think that is deeply problematic.
I mean, this is a whole other podcast. I love the idea of white dudes arguing about white privilege. It's an awesome idea for a separate podcast. I mean, in sense, I just sort of feel like my short answer is no. My understanding of white privilege is absolutely based on my own personal experiences as a white guy growing up in a totally racist suburb of Vancouver. I think my understanding of white privilege is probably just as grounded as yours. I wasn't doing the same things you were doing, but of course, it's an understanding of white privilege is a real thing that exists. And if you're actually honest about your existence, whether you're a person of color or whether you're a white person, if you reflect on it and know, you're going to understand the world we live in, white privilege exists.
Okay, do you think here's my litmus test. Do you think it's possible to not be racist?
No, I don't want to talk about this. My question is, the question that we were talking about right now was about proselytization, and how do we teach that? What does that mean if you're a lefty, liberal person that wants to explain white privilege to other people that don't explain it? We could get in an argument about it. I actually think we both know that white privilege exists, and it's a waste of time to argue about those various things. We know it exists. It's there. The question is, how do we talk to young people about this? Or how do we talk to people about who haven't been exposed to it before? So for me, it's a question of how do you communicate? How do we communicate to students? And so this is one of my big points, is that communicating via that sort of very proselytizing, like, if you're a good person, you get this. And if you're a bad person, you don't. That's the problem. It's a failing tactic for actually successfully communicating this idea that I think we both believe in, we both think is important, and we both think should be passed on for a variety of ways. So for me, what's interesting is, how do we communicate this to people who don't always already understand it? How do we communicate this absolutely objective, factual part of our world to people who maybe, because of ideological reasons or because of privilege, aren't able to see it, And in that sense, it's like...
So how do you do it?
Well, I think, again, as I said earlier about feminism as well, I really think it's a question of saying, like, hey, listen, you need to know this if you want to live the most awesome life possible. If you want to live an honest life, but not even that, if you want to just be, if you actually want to be the real you, do you want to be a puppet of circumstance? Do you want to be like a passive plaything of your sociological context? Or do you want to make decisions for yourself? Do you want to decide who you're going to be because of who you want to be? Or do you want to be a plaything of the random house you were born into, the random race or ethnicity you were born into, the random gender or sexuality you were born into? Like, in a weird way, this is
you sort of play the freedom card, almost like the libertarian. Do you want to have free will, or do you want to be predestined?
I actually have found this to be successful with students, more successful than moralistic left-wing proselytizing. Absolutely. You've got to make an appeal in a weird way. And I actually kind of love it. It's kind of it's an old world, like, let me tell you why this idea is useful to you. I'm going to make the best argument I possibly can as to why this idea is useful to you. And you get to decide if it's useful for you or not. You decide, but I will really do my best. I'm going to do my absolute best to explain to you why you need to understand the great feminist critique of patriarchy. I want to explain to you why it's really in your own interest to understand what white privilege is. And I think that teachers and people on the left need to make that argument. They need to do the work. And I think people are lazy, and people try to just say, you should do this because if you do it, you're cool and a good, beautiful person. And if you don't do it, you're a loser. It's just an unsuccessful tactic.
What I use, and is what my mother used, what my mother repeated again and again. It's almost like out of like a Marvel superhero comic. My mother always said, she repeated like a mantra to us: to whom much is given, much is required. And that is an old kind of social gospel idea. That is an idea which I find is much, much more inspiring than sort of telling like some kid from Chateauguay, like, you have white privilege and so you need to be kicked down the stairs. Like, we need to instead to tell somebody, you know what, you have a bunch of advantages, and like, you should, the whole like kind of much maligned now kind of noblesse oblige idea, right? That like that produced the Trudeaus and the Kennedys and all these like patrician families, where they had this idea that like, if you're really fortunate, if like things have gone really well for you, you should try and like give back in various ways, right? And that being like a motive, I find that so much more inspiring and motivating. Like what I tell my sons, and what I've always told my sons, I don't tell them like, you have privilege, you're like an asshole, you need to like shut up and like let other people, don't take up too much space. I tell them like, you know what, you have a lot of advantages. You're really smart, you're good looking, you have a lot of like advantages. I expect you to stand up for the weak and stand up to the strong, right? I told them this is a heroic ideal, right? And you know, the funny thing is, you know, I told you this on the phone last time when we were talking about when you were researching the article. The funny thing is that people say that Jordan Peterson is this like alt-right figure. But in fact, I've been told by a number of students that Jordan Peterson saved them from the alt-right. And the explanation, I mean, I've heard various versions of it, but it sort of comes down to the same thing. They say, you know, okay, I'll give you one example. It's the same example I gave Barbara Kay the other day. That this one guy, he said, you know, I grew up in a household where my mother was, my parents broke up in a really ugly way, and my father was like a real dick. And so my mother just went into this like spiral where she was incredibly angry at men, and she just was like furious at men. And then she went to Concordia, and she was in a particular program, and she got like more kind of like, it was fueled with all this very kind of feminist kind of rhetoric. And so I was constantly being told as a kid and a young teenager that I basically sucked just because I was male. And I was like a horrible like person because I was male. And so he ended up becoming this like MRA guy. And he was like, you know, going onto the fucking bullshit site of Voice for Men and all these like, and he was like, he was getting into all this MRA stuff. And he said, you know, actually, like finding, he talked about it almost like a religious thing. He's like, you know, discovering Jordan Peterson was, he saved me from the men's rights movement. He saved me from those MRE. Because what Jordan Peterson made me realize is that I was basically just doing exactly the same thing my mom was doing. That he made me realize that like the MRA thing is basically just another identity politics, grievance-driven movement where you blame everybody else for your problems. You take responsibility for absolutely nothing. Everything else is like, everything that's wrong with your life is a function of some structural thing, whether it be capitalism or patriarchy or feminism or, you know, whatever. Like you have these big demonic forces that are availed against you, and they are responsible for everything that's wrong with your life. And he said, actually, what was so liberating in discovering Jordan Peterson is Jordan Peterson said, you know what? Stop blaming people for your life. Jordan Peterson said to me, your mother is the only parent that actually showed up. Why don't you start respecting your mother? Like, stop being such an asshole. He's like, Jordan he talked about how he had this actual online discourse, like comments, and he said Jordan Peterson was like, you know what, you should honor your father and mother, and since your father is an absent dick, you should be honoring your mother. Yes, she was upset because of what happened in her life, but you know what, she actually made all your meals and paid all your school fees and showed up to your school plays, and you should actually respect her and honor her. And he said he was the first person in my life who told me to take responsibility for my life.
You know, there's this whole thing, like there's a Kabbalistic idea, esoteric Judaism, like that nothing in the world can exist if it isn't like at one level willed by God. If at one level God doesn't allow something to exist, it can't exist. Now, whatever. You don't need to believe in God for this, but what I take this to mean is like everything has a little bit of truth. And for me, Jordan Peterson is a perfect example of like lots of what he says has little tiny kernels of truth. But this is the thing, like evil isn't Satan. Satan isn't some guy who comes in and says, guess what? Humans have 15 limbs. Like, no, like if you're just 100% lie, of course your 100% lie doesn't exist. The only way to convince people of something is to actually have an idea that's kind of starts with something true and twists that idea. And Jordan Peterson is a perfect example of this. I watched a whole bunch of his stuff because my alt-right guys were into him, and I was like, all right. One guy, he was like, this is a favorite. You got to watch it. So I watched a whole bunch of it. And I got to say, Jordan Peterson made a bunch of points that are totally reasonable, and every one of them he twisted into a bunch of bullshit. And it's like, it's right in he has, yeah, of course he has. You know where I learned about this from? It's a take on this a particular, his name is Bilam. He's a bad guy in the Jewish Bible. And when I learned that this bad guy was a prophet, and I was like, what? A bad guy can be a prophet? I assumed prophets were the good guys. And I was like, no. Evil dudes, they are also prophets or whatever, or women too. Let's not be sexist about this. Evil men and evil women can have an access to certain kinds of truth, but what they do is they pervert or twist or fuck up that truth, and that is absolutely what Jordan Peterson does. I've seen him make great points. He makes a great point about what the left does wrong. He makes points that I agree with in terms of what the left runs down, and then he turns around and says, and that's why left-wing humanity professors are the most dangerous people in the world. And it's like, okay, now you're being a hysterical, black and white, demonizing moron. And Jordan Peterson does that all the time. He takes little kernels of truth and he twists them into untruths. And so it's like, I can't get whatever. Sure, does he give you good advice about your mom? Yeah, maybe. Should people take responsibility for their lives? Yeah, of course. Is it possible to take that and to twist it into something untrue? Yeah, completely. I mean, that's a whole other thing. I was just like, I mean, Jordan Peterson as a whole, I think it's a perfect example of taking little truths and twisting them into things that are untrue. Like Bilam. So Bilam was a prophet, and so what he knew was he knew the exact percentage of each day that God was angry. That's what he knew, and he was right. He was right. He knew the exact amount of seconds.
He's like
per
a hedge
day
fund manager.
that God was angry, And so of course Jordan Peterson says some things that are true. Of course he does. Yeah. It's like truth is like, yeah, you can take something that's true and twist it into something that's total bullshit, right? So do left-wing profs make mistakes? And so for me, I agree completely. I think left-wing profs and certain liberals, they fall into this proselytizing sort of mode where they say, like, you should do this or else you're a bad person. And I honestly think that's a terrible way to communicate ideas that I believe in 100%. As I've already said, like communicating to people about what white privilege is and what structural racism is, all these various things, the necessity of the feminist critique of patriarchy, all of these things are absolutely true. The real thing comes down to how are we going to communicate them? How are we going to express them? How are we going to talk to people about them? And if we do it within this frame of the mustard seed, either oh, I'm just going to say the truth, and if you're a good person, you'll believe me. And if you're a bad person, you won't believe me. Bullshit. Bullshit. That's bullshit pedagogy, bullshit prophecy, and bullshit teaching.
I don't even know if necessarily. I mean, I think that the whole proselytizing model is to some extent like a violation of the separation between church and state. But let's leave that alone for a minute. Even if I believed, as I often do, that the proselytizing thing is a good idea, right? I think that progressives do it in a shitty way. Right? If you look at the United States, actually, this is all of North America. Okay, the university that teaches the most languages in all of the United States, way more than Harvard, Yale, Princeton, or any other university, is Brigham Young University in Salt Lake City, Utah. And they have language classes that are for languages that are spoken by a few thousand people on one South Sea island, right? And the reason why they have such amazing language classes is because they want to proselytize, right? They want to actually go, follow the Great Commission at the end of the Gospel of Mark, go into the world and preach the gospel to all the nations, right? So they want to preach. So they understand, and the Wahhabis understand this perfectly too, the Wahhabi Muslims. They understand that you go into a community first, you build hospitals, you build schools, you learn the language, you integrate yourself in the community, and then you preach your shit. So progressives have this idea that somehow you can just skip all those steps, speak in an impenetrable jargon, and just tell people they suck, and that somehow this is going to be a big selling point. When in fact, the most successful social movements in the history of the world, namely, Islam and Christianity, have both been really successful precisely because when they go into a new area, they actually learn the language of the people there. They minister to their needs, and I think Jordan Peterson, he goes into these communities, these online communities, and he gives these young men what they need. He ministers to their needs. He talks to them. He empathizes with them. And it's we might think it's ridiculous. And it took me a really long time to see what the hell was going on there, because it's for me, reading about a Victorian getting excited by the legs of a piece of furniture, so they have to be covered up because it's too erotic for them. For me, finding Jordan Peterson really, really deep is it's akin to that. It's dude, it's just a leg of a furniture. But because I grew up with a rich religious tradition and wisdom tradition, and I got a lot of that stuff. So, but there are a lot of young people out there that are starving for this kind of stuff. And he's giving them something they're not getting from anywhere else.
What's he giving them?
Basic common sense wisdom about how to live in the world. That they're not. It used to be back in the day, people would get this from their Hebrew school, from their Sunday school, from their religious. They would get it from their coaches. They would get it from so many different.
But
quarters.
This is why, yes,
increasingly they don't get it from anybody.
But this is why it's all. I mean, the only way to end this podcast is a full fist fight. But if we're into Jordan Peterson
Since you're a
right
total
now,
beta male, I'm gonna
there's-
kick your ass.
I don't want to ruin all of his equipment here. There's this really expensive. I would just totally knock this whole table over right now. But this guy is totally nice and sweet.
God, you're such a
He
Jew,
hasn't
just
said-
like
he
Jesus,
hasn't
turning
said-
over the tables, the money changers. Yeah,
No, I was like,
There's
I don't know.
good Jameson on this
there's
table,
moments when I just
so.
look at it. Sometimes I just think of it. It's just all a massive crisis in masculinity. Like what you just said is just like, oh, like little boys who don't have daddies. You know what I mean? Like, and I shouldn't belittle that because it's a real thing to be a little boy who never had a father figure or whatever. But like when you say that, what's Jordan Peterson giving them? It's just some kind of this vague male. They desperately, again, there's this crisis in masculinity, and they want to have some kind of sense of themselves as masculine subjects, since they fall for this Jordan Peterson. I really do. I honestly really do think. I don't know. This is where it's like, right, talking to the mic. Yeah. I think a crisis of masculinity is like unavoidable. I think that's, I don't know, after my time talking to alt-right guys for this is like the crisis in masculinity seems to me to be more important than like issues of race. At least the people that I talk to, it was all, I mean, gender, masculinity, sexuality. These guys are like, they're obsessed with this stuff. In my experience, but again, I was only just talking to these Canadian people, much more than they're obsessed with the race type stuff. But it's in there too. It's in there too. But yeah.
All right, you get the last word. So, do you want to say anything else? Like,
I
fucking hate you, John.
No.
No. But like, you get the
course
last
not.
word. So, what is
course not.
your take on this?
I don't have my life, the universe, and everything. We've been careening
42.
We've been careening through a lot. No, I really think, I know we didn't talk about the article that much, but in some ways, one of the real
tried.
things, one of the real things I wanted to get at was this idea of like this left-wing moralism and proselytization. And I believe with the left-wing, I believe in the left-wing project. I'm not a moderate. I believe in the left-wing project totally. I just think we're communicating it incorrectly and talking about it wrong. I think that being moralistic and judgmental and attacky about it is the wrong way to go. I almost would say, you might disagree with this, it's kind of the Christian way to go, in the bad sense, in the like Satan sense. And I actually think that we need to think much less about demonizing people and think about their personal psychology and really being attentive to like people come to their situations through the lives they've lived. If we've come to a more liberal, lefty, enlightened place, if you think you've come to a more enlightened place, do the best you can to share that with people that you consider might be less enlightened than you, rather than assuming they're the spawn of Satan who are evil and ugly and should be possibly exterminated.
Thank you so much for coming on the podcast and talking with me and drinking with me and putting up with me interrupting you and spilling my beer all over. So
good times, John. Thanks very much.
Okay. So if you would like to support the Likeville podcast and my sobriety, definitely go to iTunes and like us on iTunes, and also share our podcast with the world. If you would like to support us materially, you can support us, become a Patreon supporter, so that dear young Sebastian can pay his rent. He's almost homeless. It's really ugly.
That's why I didn't want to bust any of his equipment. Sebastian's the good guy in this situation.
All right. So have a great day, and we'll see you later. Bye.